When we're anxious, we tend to overestimate the threat. And then we also underestimate our ability to be resourceful and to deal with this threat if this worst case scenario were to happen. And there's a lot of research that supports that even if we try to predict what would, destroy us, it actually doesn't. We are so much more resilient than we think we would be.
That was Dr. Laura Roberts, a New York City psychologist who specializes in anxiety. And this is Epicenter NYC. We connect our communities to news, information, and each other. I'm your host, Amber Castillo. For many of us, election season comes with spikes in stress and anxiety. With so much uncertainty, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, especially when the news and social media seem to only amplify our worries. The constant barrage of headlines, debates, and predictions can make it difficult to stay focused on our daily lives, leaving us feeling powerless and emotionally drained. But to help us navigate it all is Dr. Laura Roberts. Today, she joins me to discuss practical strategies to manage election and post-election anxiety, from calming techniques to finding resilience, so that we can stay grounded even as emotions run high. Before we jump in, a quick message from our team.
Hi, I'm Mariana from the Epicenter NYC team. Did you know that anxiety, sleep problems, and muscle pain could be symptoms of long COVID? Take the steps needed to protect yourself, your family, and your plans. Get vaccinated against COVID-19. We can help you schedule your appointment and even arrange you right there. Email us at hello@epicenter-nyc.com or call or text us at 917-818-2690.
Now back to the show. Here's my conversation with Dr. Roberts.
My name is Laura Roberts, and I am associate professor in Lehman College, and I'm in the Department of Counseling, Leadership, Literacy, and Special Education. And I specifically teach in the Counselor Education Program, which is a program specifically for school counselors and training.
How long have you been doing that?
I am in my 16th year there, and I'm also a psychologist, and that's my other work outside of the college.
Where do you work as a psychologist, and what's that practice like?
It's a small private practice out of my home, and I work with individuals, mostly children. Although when you work with children, you also work with adults because including the families, parents is very important.
Is there a certain area that you specialize in treating?
I love anxiety. I find the treatment of anxiety fascinating because it is very treatable, first of all, that we're not just wired to be anxious all the time. But if you understand what it's the purpose of anxiety and the process of sort of working through it, I think it's very interesting. And again, I have a lot of hope that it's very treatable too.
I'm always interested in how people get into their passions. What brought you to psychology and treating or helping people with anxiety?
I actually used to be a teacher. I was actually a special ed teacher in New York City public schools. And it was my very first teaching job. I remember they gave me this group of, and again, I didn't have any experience, and they gave me a position working with kids who had behavioral issues and some psychological issues. And I actually loved it. I just loved it. And I said, well, I think I want to do much more. I felt like in the classroom was one thing, but I didn't know if necessarily just teaching would be was my niche. But I obviously teach now at the college level. But from that moment on, I just wanted to understand what it is that drives behavior or thoughts. And I learned just through some training that a person's behavior almost always makes sense if you have a sense of what they're thinking.
I was wondering if there was some guidance around how New Yorkers can cope with the anxiety about the elections, either election-related violence, anxiety about the actual election outcome. If there are any tips you can give.
Well, let me go back to just what anxiety is. Again, when we're anxious, we tend to overestimate the threat. Oftentimes we do. We perceive it as a bigger threat than it actually is to us. And then we also underestimate our ability to be resourceful and to deal with this threat if this worst case scenario were to happen. And there's a lot of research that supports that even if we try to predict what would, destroy us, it actually doesn't. We are so much more resilient than we think we would be. And so just keep that in mind. And if you think historically, when you've gone through other difficult times, you probably were able to recover from it. Think back about COVID, right? When that first was like on our radar, like COVID, oh my gosh. Did you ever think that you'd be here now today and living a normal life? I mean, There was a time when said, oh, people said we'll only be fist pumping or arm, whatever we were doing we won't never hugging again. But yet you see how resilient we were. People thought that New York City was going to be a ghost town forever. And in a very short amount of time, it actually bounced back. And so those are just to sort of look at some of the historical moments that things that we do tend to bounce back. But I guess thinking about preparing for the worst might not necessarily be helpful, or worrying about it. And that's something I do a lot with my clients I work with. I often say, you have to look at what are all the benefits to worry. Are there, and people say, well, I'm more prepared, but are you really more prepared to handle something catastrophic if you were worrying about it? I mean, the answer is probably no, right? It's going to be catastrophic either way. And it doesn't mean to just sort of take everything so lightly, but the worry itself is causing us a lot of stress, right? And there's only so much that we can do, right? And we can vote, we can take action in that sense. And there's things you can do in your immediate surroundings, right? Find support. But anticipating this, again, loss of our democracy is maybe it's a little bit too early to think that way. I think, it might not necessarily be accurate either. We just don't know.
Yeah. Is there an alternative or like a middle ground with the like preparing for the worst mentality where you're at least realistic in case your biggest hopes don't come true, but without all of the stress and the anxiety that comes from that worry? And yeah.
So what I'll often do, and there's a strategy in cognitive behavior therapy that I might use, and it's called the catastrophizing. And so I'll often ask the person, what is the very, very worst case scenario? And I try to go deep into the worst case scenario. And then they might describe it. Let's say, for example, and I'm going to give you a different example, just so like when I work with children, I might say, let's say they're afraid to go to the dentist. And I'll say, what's the very worst case scenario? And they're saying like, well, if I go there, it might hurt. I said, no, the worst case scenario is that they knock your teeth out. The worst case scenario is that you end up having, and they're like, what? And I said, well, how likely is that to happen? And they'll be like, well, I don't think so. Well, how do you know it's unlikely to happen? Because I don't know anyone it's ever happened to. I've never heard of anything like this. And they can come up with reasons why it's probably unlikely. And I'll say, well, what could you do if it did happen? I said, well, I could get implants put in, I guess, if I had to. There'd be a solution there, right? And then I go about what's the best case scenario. And then they kind of will go in that direction. Well, the best case scenario is going to be fine. I'm like, no, the best case scenario is that you show up and there's a big party there waiting for you. There's no dental. They look at your teeth and they say, your teeth look perfect. There's nothing wrong. And so what I try to point out is that those two scenarios are probably just as unlikely. And then I talk about what is now likely to happen. And what's likely to happen is that they'll go to the dentist and there'll be a little bit of discomfort and won't feel great. You may be in some pain afterward. And it might, kind of put you out for a little bit, but you'll be okay. You'll be able to pick up the pieces again, because we all have strengths. And that's really important to realize, that we sometimes underestimate our strengths, our internal resources. And again, it's not to dismiss that because some threats are real. They are real. They can be real. But when we're thinking about them, they might not necessarily be justified at that moment. And that's what I try to just emphasize. It's not to minimize anyone's experience or how this outcome will impact them. But what it is, I mean, the important thing is what you can do now in this moment. You can have, meaningful dialogue, which I know you talked about too. Having meaningful dialogue sometimes can be challenging with people who have different views, right?
Are there certain best practices for when you are trying to have meaningful conversations with folks who you don't share the same political views, especially as we're coming into Thanksgiving and family and friend heavy gatherings?
Those are the biggest challenges, right? Because I first of all, I look at a family as it's a system, right? It's a system that's in functioning and everyone has a role. And when people, like let's say children, or they become adults and they step away, they come back and they kind of find themselves feeling maybe infantilized back and being a child again in that family, right? But they may have different views than their parents or even extended family. I think what's important is whenever you enter a conversation, if you go into it with an agenda, starting with an attack, that's where I think we go wrong a lot of the times. We often feel it's important to be right and we want to make sure our point is heard. But imagine if you instead went into the conversation with, let me find some common ground here. Because chances are, as humans, we are more similar than we are different. And if you think about it, even some of these issues that are on the docket, right, in terms of this election, let's say, you might say the conservatives have one view about, I don't know, abortion, and versus maybe liberals have different views. But at the end, no one wants harm, right? Necessarily. They might think, but we think the other side wants harm, and then the other side thinks that we want harm. but it could be that the common ground is both, and we all believe in like certain moral beliefs, right? We believe that it's important to be kind or important to be, we all have rights. And so those things are things that we could maybe have some common ground. We disagree on the process, right? Of like some fundamental differences in terms of, let's say for that one in particular, you might say to a person, do you believe in I mean, as a woman, I might say that, let's say I believe that it's important for me to have a right to choose what I do with my body. Most people would agree with that. But when it comes to that one issue, maybe not everyone would agree on it. So it doesn't mean that we're so different. It's just on that one particular issue. And so there's probably more common ground than you think.
And to follow up, is there any guidance you provide specifically around for marginalized groups like people of color, LGBTQ plus, for how do they manage symptoms if the election outcome might, or, there's anticipation that it might disproportionately affect them?
I would say this, understand that you have rights, right? There are rights. And so know what those rights are, right? And sometimes, and I think that being mindful of the fact that you have agency. Everyone has agency. It's easy to feel depleted and feel as though when those things are, when things are taken away from you. But there's always resources out there and there's always someone who's willing to listen and help. What I think it is also important is not to stay silent in terms of, suffering in silence. If there's something it's not helpful or some outcome that's not what you had hoped for, then you have to be vocal about it, right? But to the right people, right? So I would say talk to the people that can actually be helpful. And I would say this to students too. Students have rights. We should always feel safe to speak our opinion in a kind and constructive way. And so don't feel silenced. That's what's important.
And would you say this is a moment to invest more in your community in terms of time, in terms of volunteering? Like, are there other things that you recommend when people feel overwhelmed?
Yeah, actually, that is a really good when you just said, doing things in your community and things where you feel as though you have agency. It's interesting because when we do things like that, we often feel like I just feel overwhelmed. But when we do those things, we take the focus off of ourselves. And so when we help others, we tend to feel better overall. And it also helps us realize that we're not alone. We're not the only ones suffering. And so that's important to do things like that too.
Yeah. And then finally, are there any lessons you've learned from helping people manage some of this anxiety and also the fallout and the outcome from previous elections that you think might be helpful for dealing with this one?
I remember that last election very well. And it even brings up feelings of like, it actually almost brings tears to my eyes. I remember, the students were so excited about the outcome, what they thought, not the last one. I mean, the one.
Oh, 2016?
Yeah. Some students had gone down, I think it was to the Javits Center where they were going to be celebrating Hillary Clinton being the next president. And they were very excited about it. And the outcome was obviously very different. And I remember the next day I had made class and I remember thought to myself, I want to try to address and try to help them think about, ways of thinking more helpful. But I think I made the mistake of not allowing them the period of feeling really sad and mourning this loss, because that's what it is. When an outcome isn't what you thought, any outcome that's not what you expected, it feels like a loss. And I think there's a process. I mean, you can go to that mindset of like trying to be optimistic, but in the moment, it doesn't feel good when someone says, well, let's look at the positives. We don't want to do that. That's very dismissive. And so same thing, like any loss, if you lose a loved one, eventually you'll be okay. But in the moment, it feels terrible. And so I think it's important to join people in their pain in that moment, validate their feelings, no matter what. Just let them feel that way and then they feel supported. And that won't last forever. Eventually, then they'll be able to sort of move into the phase of taking action. But there is a process, I think, of mourning if this outcome is not what you would hope for.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. Is there anything I didn't ask that you think is important to just be aware of as we're dealing with a lot of election-related anxiety, stress, and other symptoms? Yeah.
I would say just be mindful of what you're like, of what you expose yourself to, and so, you've heard about the whole confirmation bias and the negativity bias. We tend to look for information that supports. And again, there's so much information out there that we don't even know where it's coming from. And is it accurate? People believe, on one side, they think their news is accurate, but who's right? I mean, there's all this information. And I would say, try to minimize your exposure. I mean, how much do you really need to be exposed to? And if it's causing you tremendous amount of distress, it might not be helpful in the end. You've heard of the saying, Like when they say when you're on the airplane, they always say like, you help yourself first with the oxygen mask. Then it's important to take good care of yourself and to sort of just do what you need so that you can be well equipped to handle things. That's the thing. If you take care of yourself overall, your own mental health, and you'll be more equipped to handle anything. Take your phone and put it somewhere else. And it's not that I'm not guilty of this myself. I've done it too. But when you can do that, first of all, when you're on your phone at night, you're interfering with the production of melatonin in your brain, which is the hormone that you need in order to sleep. So sometimes when we think, oh, I have the urge to pick up the phone, I got to pick it up, and we feel anxious. But if you just sit there for a minute, the anxiety will peak, it will go away. Yeah, it really, really will. I'm going to give you one more little example, okay? And this is a personal one that I've experienced and I share with my students a lot. I was flying back on a plane one time, and I was I don't mind flying. I'm fine with flying, but I'm also very busy on the plane. I'm always like doing lots of different things. So I see myself, I'll be like distracted with things. And the pilot came over the airway and he said, well, we're going to have to shut down the food service because it's going to be some bumpy air ahead. And I remember what was so interesting. I remember like I had this like in my chest. I was like, oh, because I think I was studying cognitive behavior therapy at the time. I was like, oh, how interesting. So I'm a bit of a nerd. I focus on those things. And so what was interesting is what I did next. And what my urge was. My urge was to take out my book and I said, wait a minute, I'm actually interrupting the anxiety. Let me just put everything away and see how long this lasts. And so as the flight attendants, they sit down and now the plane starts, bouncing all over the place. And I said, oh, how interesting. And I just acknowledged, I observed my thoughts, like, oh, I'm having the thought the plane's going to go down, just a thought. But telling my brain that it was a thought that is not actually real is also a strategy. And I timed my anxiety, how long it lasted. And how long do you think it lasted? Like 4.5 minutes. And it was interesting because to this day, I cannot make myself experience that anxiety anymore because I had to let it peak on its own. But for me allowing it, not even realizing that I was interrupting it all the time, I'm distracting myself. I just sat with it to see how long it would last. And it always goes away. And so it's allowing yourself to experience those things. It's so incredibly helpful for your nervous system.
And there's still a time and space to distract ourselves in terms of reading a favorite book and...
Right. And I think that's important too. Now, and again, I would say, so it doesn't mean everyone has to drop all those hateful behaviors, right? I think there's a time and a place for it. And again, I think it can be helpful if you do it in a supportive way. It's not, we used to do something called like flooding, and they would like put yourself in front of the stimuli that you're so fearful of. But that isn't necessarily helpful but if you can allow yourself to experience small doses of this thing that you're fearful of, or whatever it is, whether it's just the anxiety itself, in small doses, you'll see it goes away. But the key is to at least see it drop a little bit and just allow that process to happen. And then next time you do a little bit more. So it's like a gradual exposure.
Just to clarify, behaviors like talking it out with their friends if we're experiencing a lot of, especially election-related anxiety, or writing it out in our journals, would those count as safety behaviors, or could those also be supportive behaviors?
If you're seeking reassurance a lot of the time, that might not be as helpful because then your brain thinks you have to seek reassurance, right? Mm-hmm. Until the next thing comes up, but what is this? But what is this? But if you are just trying to sort of process something, sometimes it is helpful to just but I think it's important to who you talk to let them, make sure they understand you're not looking for advice. You're just venting for a minute. I mean, someone who can just validate your feelings. When someone validates your feelings, it usually tends to go down much quicker. But when someone says, usually when we do it with kids a lot too, oh, you shouldn't feel that way, then it just makes it intensifies the emotions. And so I would say be selective of who you decide to talk to if you're feeling anxious or worried. And also, it should be a person that's not going to make it worse by saying, oh, I know you're right. You want it to be a person who's going to sort of listen. And then, when you're working with teens, I think with teens in particular, they never want advice. And so you have to let them just talk about things, ask them questions, and ask them how they'll come up with their own solution, because they want to maintain that anyway. So empower them.
This conversation is a part of Epicenter NYC's coverage of underrepresented communities and issues around the 2024 elections. To read more of our political stories, click the link in our show notes. That's all for today. Thanks for listening, and thanks for supporting us as we do our best to support our community. We couldn't do it without you. For more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at epicenter-nyc.com. Our intro music is All the Pretty Horses by Karavika. You can find more of their music on their website, linked to in our podcast description.